I understand. Proceed as planned.
Zelda Monroe had $200 million, a mansion overlooking the coast, and a son who had never once seen her worry about money in his entire life. So when she told him the company had collapsed overnight, that the house was being seized, and that she had nothing left to give him, she watched his fiancée's face very, very closely. She needed to see who would stay when the money disappeared, because she already suspected the answer, and she was terrified she was right. What she found out in the following 2 weeks would end one relationship and quietly begin another one, right in front of her, and she would only realize it once it was almost too late. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what you need to hold onto as this story unfolds. A mother who built a fortune with her own 2 hands, now willing to pretend she lost every dollar of it. A son who believes the woman he's about to marry loves him for who he is. And a quiet, overlooked young assistant who has never once asked either of them for anything at all. 3 questions will carry you through the next hour. What made Zelda so certain something was wrong that she was willing to fake losing everything to find out? What will the fiancé do the moment she believes the money is gone for good? And who is really standing beside Weston Monroe once the mansion, the accounts, and the easy life disappear? Stay close, because the answers arrive in an order you will not expect, and some of them will surprise even the people living through them. Zelda Monroe was raised in a small block of apartments on the edge of Phoenix, Arizona, the daughter of a hotel laundress and a father who worked 2 jobs and still barely covered the rent each month. The apartment had 1 bedroom, a window unit that struggled against the desert heat, and a kitchen table where Zelda did her homework by the light of a single bulb while her mother folded other people's linens in the next room. She used to tell people that poverty didn't just teach her to work hard, it taught her to watch people closely, because in a life with nothing to spare, you learned quickly who would help you carry a bag of groceries up 3 flights of stairs and who would simply watch you struggle and walk past. Her father died when she was 17, a heart attack at the loading dock where he had worked nights for over a decade, and the funeral was paid for with money her mother borrowed from a coworker she barely knew. Zelda remembered standing at that funeral, embarrassed by the second-hand dress she wore and furious at a world that seemed to reward some families with ease and punish others with nothing but exhaustion. She promised herself in that moment, quietly and without ceremony, that she would build something so solid that no one in her family would ever again have to borrow money to bury someone they loved. It was not a dream born of greed. It was born of grief, and it never left her. What almost no one outside her closest circle ever knew was that Zelda's caution around love had not begun with Weston's engagement at all, but decades earlier, with a young man named Harold Pratt she had married at 20, barely 3 years before her father passed away. Harold was charming in the exact way Delphine would later prove to be, warm and attentive whenever there was an audience, quietly dismissive the moment they were alone. In the earliest days of their marriage, when Zelda still worked double shifts at a diner to help cover rent, Harold had been endlessly patient, praising her work ethic and promising her a future neither of them could yet afford. The moment her small logistics idea began showing its first real signs of promise 2 years later, something in him shifted in ways she was too young and too in love to fully recognize at the time. He began pushing her to sign over a larger and larger share of the fledgling company for tax purposes, insisting it was simply smarter for a married couple to consolidate assets under his name, since he handled their finances more comfortably than she did. Zelda, exhausted from working 2 jobs while building the company from nothing, trusted him enough to agree to more than she should have, until a friend at the bank quietly warned her that Harold had already begun inquiring about a full buyout of her shares, structured in a way that would leave her with almost nothing if their marriage ever ended. She confronted him that same week, and rather than deny it, he simply admitted, coldly and without apology, that he had never expected the company to actually succeed, and that he intended to make sure he benefited from it regardless of whether their marriage survived the process. The divorce that followed was quiet, quick, and deeply humbling, and Zelda rebuilt full ownership of her company only through months of legal fighting and a settlement that cost her nearly every dollar she had saved at the time. She never spoke about Harold Pratt often, even with Weston, who grew up knowing only the barest outline of the story, but the experience shaped every instinct she carried into every relationship she watched unfold around her afterward. including her own sons. She had learned, in the most painful way possible, that people rarely reveal their true priorities while things are going well. They reveal them the moment there is something real to gain or something real to lose, and by then it is often already too late to protect yourself from the damage. It was this exact lesson, carried quietly for nearly 4 decades, that convinced her the staged collapse was not cruelty toward Delphine, but the only honest test she had ever found that actually worked. At 22, with a small loan from a family friend who believed in her far more than any bank did, and a head full of ideas nobody else in her circle understood, she started a modest logistics company out of a rented garage on the outskirts of the city. The early years were brutal. She drove her own delivery routes when drivers called in sick, negotiated fuel contracts by phone until her voice gave out, and slept on a cot in the office more nights than she slept in her own bed. She made mistakes that nearly bankrupted her twice, and both times she rebuilt from almost nothing, refusing every offer to sell the company for a quick profit, because she had promised herself she would build something that lasted, not something she could simply cash out and walk away from. 3 decades later, that single rented garage had become a shipping and freight empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. With her name on the downtown headquarters building, and her instincts still sharper than any analyst on her payroll. She never forgot the smell of that garage, or the sound of the window unit rattling in her childhood apartment, and she made a point of visiting the company's warehouse floors personally, remembering the names of drivers and dockworkers the way her mother had once remembered the names of hotel guests whose sheets she folded. Money had changed her circumstances completely. It had not changed the way she watched people, or the instincts she had sharpened long before she ever had anything worth protecting. Her son, Weston, grew up surrounded by a comfort Zelda herself had never known: private schools, a house with more rooms than the family ever used, and a mother who worked long hours but never once let him forget where the family had truly come from. She made sure he understood the difference between being given something and earning it, insisting he take a summer job on the warehouse floor at 16 despite his objections, and refusing to buy him a car until he had saved enough of his own earnings to cover half of it himself. He resented the lessons at the time, the way most teenagers resent anything that looks like inconvenience, but by his 20s he had come to understand exactly why his mother had insisted on them, and he was grateful for it in a way he rarely said out loud. He was gentle by nature, quick to trust, and endlessly loyal to the people who were kind to him, which was exactly the quality Zelda loved most about him and worried over most as well. She had watched him as a boy give away his own lunch to a classmate who had forgotten theirs, watched him as a teenager stand up for a friend being mocked by older students even though it cost him socially, and watched him as a young man tip generously and remember the names of waitstaff and security guards that other men in his position overlooked entirely. It was a beautiful quality, and Zelda knew, from long and painful experience of her own, that it was also exactly the kind of quality that made a good person vulnerable to people who had learned how to imitate kindness without ever truly feeling it. After finishing business school, Weston took a leadership role inside the company's logistics division, determined to prove himself on merit rather than his last name. He insisted on starting in a mid-level position rather than accepting the executive title his mother offered him, working his way up over 4 years through late nights, difficult negotiations, and a genuine willingness to learn from employees who had been with the company far longer than he had. By the time he was promoted to division head, the promotion came not from Zelda's insistence, but from a unanimous recommendation by the very department heads who had once trained him from the ground floor. He worked long hours, kept a small circle of close friends he had known since college, and showed little interest in serious relationships for years, focused instead on building a reputation of his own, separate from his mother's considerable shadow. Then he met Delphine Caraway at an industry gala hosted downtown, a fundraiser for a children's hospital that had drawn most of the city's wealthiest names into one crowded ballroom. Delphine arrived on the arm of another executive that evening, but by the end of the night she had somehow ended up seated beside Weston, laughing easily at his jokes and asking thoughtful questions about the logistics industry that most people found impossibly boring. Within weeks he was telling his mother he had finally found someone who understood him completely, someone confident enough to walk into any room and command it, yet warm enough, or so it seemed at the time, to make him feel like the most important person in that same room. Delphine was polished, quick-witted, and effortlessly comfortable in every setting she entered, the kind of woman who complimented waitstaff loudly enough for an entire table to hear, then forgot their names the very moment she turned away to continue a conversation about herself. She had grown up in a wealthy suburb 2 states away, the daughter of a real estate developer and a former pageant queen, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once had to wonder whether a room would welcome her. Weston found her confidence magnetic in a way he had never experienced before, mistaking her polish for genuine warmth and her ambition for shared vision. The way people in love often mistake performance for authenticity when they are not yet looking closely enough to tell the difference. After 10 months of dinners, weekend trips, and long conversations about the future they both claimed to want, Weston proposed at a private dinner on a rooftop overlooking the city lights, nervous in a way his mother had rarely seen him before that night. Delphine said yes with tears that seemed genuine at the time, and the two of them celebrated with a small circle of friends late into the evening while Zelda watched from a nearby table, smiling for the photographs and toasting the engagement with a glass of champagne she barely touched. The months that followed the proposal were, by every outward measure, genuinely happy ones, and Zelda made a point of remembering that later, when it would have been easy to rewrite the entire relationship in her mind as something rotten from the very beginning. Delphine threw herself into the wedding planning with real enthusiasm, spending entire weekends with Weston touring venues along the coast, comparing florists, and debating guest lists late into the night over takeout containers spread across his kitchen table. She learned to make his favorite pasta dish from his childhood, badly at first and then with genuine improvement, and surprised him one weekend with tickets to a small jazz club he had mentioned loving only once, in passing months earlier, proof that she had been listening more closely than he realized at the time. There were quiet mornings during that stretch when Weston woke early simply to watch her sleep, feeling something close to disbelief that he had found someone who fit so easily into the shape of his life. He told his mother once, during that same period, that Delphine made him feel like he didn't have to perform or prove anything, that he could simply exist beside her without the constant low hum of expectation he sometimes felt in business settings. Zelda listened to these stories with real warmth of her own, wanting badly to believe every word of them, and for a while she nearly convinced herself that the small, nagging discomfort she felt about certain comments Delphine made was simply the natural caution of a mother who had never fully learned to let go. It was precisely this genuine happiness, this real and unforced warmth between them during the engagement's early months, that made the eventual unraveling so much harder for Weston to accept later on. A woman who had been coldly transactional from the very first date would have been easy to walk away from. A woman who had, for a real stretch of time, seemed to genuinely love him before circumstances changed what she was willing to tolerate, was a far more painful thing to lose, and a far more important thing for him to eventually understand fully. It started with small comments Zelda might have once let pass without a second thought. At a business dinner 2 months into the engagement, Delphine mentioned, almost proudly, that she had never had to work a single day in her adult life and didn't particularly intend to start once she was properly married, laughing lightly as though it were an obvious and universally shared goal rather than a statement that made 2 of the guests at the table visibly uncomfortable. Weston laughed along with her, clearly unbothered, but Zelda noticed the exact wording she had chosen, and filed it away quietly the way she had once filed away the small, telling details of business partners who later turned out to be far less trustworthy than they first appeared. Later that same month, a longtime household accountant named Priscilla Vance mentioned, carefully and reluctantly, that Delphine had asked her more than once about the exact structure of Weston's inheritance, how the family trust was divided, and whether a prenuptial agreement was truly necessary between 2 people who loved each other as much as they did. Priscilla had worked for the Monroe family for over 15 years and knew better than to gossip carelessly, but she also knew Zelda well enough to understand that this particular detail mattered, and she brought it to her privately, out of loyalty rather than idle curiosity. None of it, taken individually, was damning on its own. Plenty of people asked practical questions before marriage. But Zelda had spent 30 years reading intentions across negotiating tables, and she recognized the particular sound of someone more interested in a number than a name. Zelda chose not to confront her son directly. Not yet. She had learned long ago, through painful business experience, that accusations without solid proof only pushed people further into the arms of the very person being accused, hardening their loyalty rather than opening their eyes. She refused to become the mother who ruined her son's happiness over instinct alone, no matter how sharp that instinct had proven to be in the past. Instead, she decided on something far riskier and far more revealing than any conversation could ever be. If Delphine truly loved Weston for who he was rather than what he had, then the money should never have mattered in the first place, and there was only one way to find out for certain whether that was true. Executing a fake collapse of a company worth hundreds of millions took more coordination than most people would ever believe possible. But Zelda had both the resources and the decades of earned loyalty to pull it off carefully and convincingly. She brought in only two people she trusted completely with the full truth of the plan. Her longtime attorney, a sharp, discreet man named Reginald Voss who had handled the family's legal affairs for over 20 years, and her chief financial officer of nearly 2 decades, a quiet, meticulous woman named Adiz Bello who had helped Zelda navigate 2 genuine financial crises earlier in the company's history. Both of them listened to the plan with visible concern, questioning whether it was truly necessary, but both ultimately agreed to help, trusting Zelda's judgment the same way they had trusted it through every difficult decision that came before this one. Together, the three of them built a controlled, temporary story designed to look catastrophic from the outside while remaining fully reversible behind the scenes. They seeded a rumor of a disastrous overseas shipping contract through carefully limited channels, the kind of controlled leak that would reach exactly the right ears within the industry without triggering genuine panic among employees who didn't need to be part of the deception. They froze the family's public-facing accounts temporarily, redirecting real funds through secured channels only Reginald and Adiz could access, and staged paperwork suggesting the mansion itself was being seized by aggressive creditors, complete with realistic notices that would hold up under a casual glance from anyone who happened to see them left carelessly on a counter. Nothing was actually lost. Every asset remained fully intact, quietly protected, waiting to be restored the moment the test had run its course. Weston received the news from his mother directly, delivered in a small sitting room with the curtains drawn. Her voice trembling in a way that felt entirely real because a part of her genuinely was terrified, not of losing the money, but of what the test might reveal about the woman his son intended to marry. She told him the company had made a catastrophic bet on an overseas shipping contract that had collapsed without warning, that the banks were already moving aggressively against their accounts, and that the mansion would very likely be seized within the month if things did not change dramatically and quickly. Weston sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through the implications, before pulling his mother into his arms and telling her firmly that none of it mattered as long as she was safe, and that they would rebuild everything together from nothing if that was truly what it took. Watching her son's first reaction, unfiltered and immediate, Zelda felt both an overwhelming surge of pride and a fresh, sharpening dread about what Delphine's reaction might look like in comparison. She had raised Weston to value people over possessions, and in that single moment, watching him hold her without a single question about what remained of the family's wealth, she felt certain she had succeeded in that particular lesson at least. But success in raising her son only made the stakes of the next several days feel heavier, because if Delphine failed this test the way Zelda increasingly suspected she might, Weston's heart would be the one left to absorb the damage, not the family's finances, which had never actually been at risk to begin with. Delphine's reaction came less than an hour later, once Weston finally composed himself enough to call her with the devastating news. Zelda, sitting quietly in the adjoining study under the pretense of resting after the emotional conversation with her son, heard every word of the phone call clearly through the thin door that had never quite closed properly since the house was built. Delphine's voice cracked with what sounded, at first, like genuine concern, asking if Weston was truly all right, if there was anything at all she could do to help, if perhaps they needed to speak with her own family's attorney for a second opinion on the legal situation unfolding around them. For a moment, listening through that door, Zelda allowed herself a small, hopeful flicker that her instincts had simply been wrong this time, that she had misjudged a woman who was, after all, still young and perhaps simply awkward in the specific way she expressed practical concern. Then Delphine asked, in a tone Zelda recognized instantly from years of listening to people try to disguise self-interest as thoughtfulness, whether the engagement ring appraisal papers were still valid even if the estate itself was in serious financial trouble, and whether it might make more sense to quietly sell it now before the lawyers get too deeply involved in sorting everything out. Weston, still reeling from the shock of the day, didn't seem to register the strangeness of the question at all, but Zelda, sitting silently on the other side of that thin door, felt something in her chest go cold and very still. Over the following days, the cracks in Delphine's composure widened faster and more visibly than even Zelda had expected them to. She stopped returning Weston's calls as quickly as she once had, citing sudden work emergencies and family obligations that always seemed to arise at precisely the wrong moments. Whenever Weston most needed someone to simply sit with him and talk, she canceled a planned visit to see the smaller rented apartment Weston had supposedly moved into after the mansion's paperwork was seized, claiming she wasn't feeling well and needed to rest, though a mutual friend later mentioned, entirely by accident, seeing her at a rooftop cocktail party that same evening, laughing freely among a different circle of well-dressed guests. When Delphine finally did visit the modest apartment nearly a week later, she spent most of the brief conversation asking pointed, carefully phrased questions about whether Zelda had any remaining assets tucked away somewhere safe, any offshore accounts the creditors hadn't yet discovered, any family jewelry or valuables that hadn't been formally reported and might still be quietly sold if things grew more desperate. She phrased every question as innocent concern for the family's well-being, her voice soft and sympathetic, but Zelda had spent enough years in boardrooms to recognize the particular texture of someone gathering information for their own benefit rather than someone genuinely worried about the people in front of them. 2 days later, Delphine arrived at the apartment unannounced with a bottle of wine and an unusually bright, performative energy that struck Zelda as immediately out of place given the circumstances. She spent nearly an hour talking about a friend of hers whose family had gone through something similar years earlier, describing in careful detail how that friend had managed to protect what mattered most by moving certain assets into her own name before the worst of the legal proceedings began. Framing the entire story as helpful advice rather than what it plainly was, a rehearsal for a conversation she was clearly building toward with Weston himself. Weston, still too shaken by the supposed collapse to notice the pattern, thanked her for her thoughtfulness and told her he would consider it, unaware his mother was sitting quietly in the next room absorbing every carefully chosen word. By the middle of the second week, Delphine's visits grew shorter and increasingly transactional, arriving with a checklist of questions rather than any real warmth, and leaving within 20 or 30 minutes each time, always citing some pressing obligation elsewhere. She stopped asking how Weston was feeling entirely, focusing instead on logistics, on what remained in various accounts, on whether the wedding venue deposit could still be recovered given the family's changed circumstances, and on whether it made more financial sense to postpone the wedding indefinitely until things stabilized. Zelda noticed that Delphine never once used the word we when discussing the family's situation anymore, referring instead to Weston's problems and Weston's family's debts. A small linguistic shift that told her more clearly than any single dramatic moment could have. One evening near the end of the second week, Zelda overheard Delphine on the phone in the apartment's small hallway, her voice hushed but audible through the thin walls, telling someone that she was still deciding how much longer to give this, and that she hadn't signed anything yet that couldn't be undone. Zelda did not yet know who was on the other end of that call, though she would learn soon enough, but the phrase stayed with her for days afterward, a quiet confirmation that whatever loyalty Delphine had once expressed toward Weston was already being weighed, calculated, and measured against some other option waiting patiently in the background. If you were watching this unfold exactly the way Zelda was, quietly noticing the questions getting sharper and more pointed with every single visit, would you have let the test continue to see exactly how far it would go? Or would you have stepped in immediately to protect your son from more heartbreak than was truly necessary? Type 1 in the comments if you'd have let the test continue just like Zelda did. Type 2 if you would have ended it the moment you overheard that first phone call about the ring. We'll come back to what Zelda ultimately decided in just a few minutes, and it may not be the choice you expect from a mother who has already seen this much. While Delphine's true nature slowly and painfully surfaced over those difficult days, Zelda found herself paying closer and closer attention to someone else entirely. A young woman named Harper Quinn who worked as Weston's executive assistant and had quietly kept his office running with remarkable efficiency for nearly 3 full years. Harper had grown up in modest circumstances herself in a small town 2 hours outside the city. The daughter of a single father who worked as a mechanic and had raised her largely on his own after her mother left when Harper was only 7 years old. She put herself through community college working nights at a diner, transferred later to a 4-year university on a combination of scholarships and loans, and joined Weston's division fresh out of school with no connections and no expectations beyond a genuine desire to work hard and build something stable for herself. She had organized Weston's schedule with a precision that bordered on intuition, remembering small details about his preferences, his allergies, his tendency to forget lunch entirely during stressful weeks, without ever once being asked to track any of it formally. She treated every single person in the building exactly the same way, from the senior executives who barely acknowledged her existence in the hallways to the overnight cleaning staff whose names she had bothered to learn within her very first month on the job, always greeting them warmly regardless of who else happened to be watching at the time. Colleagues occasionally teased her gently for being too nice for corporate America, a comment she always brushed off with a small laugh, insisting that kindness cost nothing and cynicism had never once made her job easier. When the news of the company's supposed catastrophic collapse spread through the office in hushed, anxious conversations near the break room, Harper did not disappear or quietly distance herself the way several of her colleagues did almost immediately, worried more about their own job security than about the people around them who were genuinely struggling. Instead, she stayed later than usual for several consecutive nights, working diligently to help transition whatever remaining operations she could manage on her own, organizing files, notifying vendors, and doing everything within her limited authority to soften the blow for the department she had come to genuinely care about over the years. When the company officially announced it could no longer keep most of its remaining staff employed, Harper accepted the layoff notice with quiet grace, thanked Weston sincerely and without a trace of resentment for the years of genuine opportunity he had given her, and told him plainly that she hoped things would work out for his family no matter what happened next. A few days after her own layoff, believing Weston was now struggling to adjust in a smaller rented apartment with very little money left to his name, Harper showed up entirely unannounced one evening with a simple bag of groceries and a home-cooked meal wrapped carefully in foil, telling him only that she remembered from years of working closely with him that he tended to forget to eat properly whenever he was under serious stress. She did not ask a single question about the company's finances, or what remained of the family's fortune, or whether Weston's situation was likely to improve anytime soon. She asked only how he was truly holding up beneath the surface, and whether there was anything at all, however small, that she could do to help him get back on his feet during what was clearly one of the hardest stretches of his adult life. Weston, exhausted and quietly devastated by Delphine's growing emotional distance over the preceding week, found himself unexpectedly moved by the sheer simplicity of Harper's gesture, and by how safe and unguarded he suddenly felt sitting across from her at his small kitchen table, sharing a meal that had cost her almost nothing but clearly meant everything. They talked for hours that night about nothing important and everything important at the same time, and for the first time in weeks Weston found himself laughing freely, without the constant low hum of anxiety that had been sitting in his chest since the day his mother first delivered the devastating news about the company. Zelda, watching quietly from the modest rented apartment she had arranged for exactly this kind of purpose, felt something settle firmly and permanently in her chest for the first time in what felt like a very long while. She had spent a lifetime believing that character revealed itself most clearly not in moments of comfortable abundance, when kindness costs nothing and generosity is easy, but in precisely the moments when there was nothing left to gain from showing up at all. Delphine had revealed her true priorities within the very first hour of believing the money had vanished. Harper, without ever once being deliberately tested, had revealed hers simply by choosing to show up again and again when it would have been far easier, and certainly far safer for her own future prospects, to quietly disappear the way so many others already had. Over the following 2 weeks, Harper continued showing up in small, unremarkable ways that added up to something Zelda found increasingly difficult to ignore. She helped Weston update his resume for job applications he insisted he needed to file, even though she herself was searching for new employment during that exact same period, her own financial situation far more precarious than his appeared to be on paper. She sat with him during a particularly difficult evening when the weight of everything finally caught up to him, listening far more than she spoke, offering no advice he hadn't asked for and no judgment about a situation she barely understood the full truth of. She never once mentioned the word money in any conversation between them, not out of performance or careful calculation, but because it genuinely never seemed to occur to her that it mattered as much as everything else they were building together during those uncertain weeks. Near the end of the second week, Weston, still unaware of his mother's full plan but increasingly curious about his own feelings toward Harper, decided almost impulsively to test something himself. He told Harper, in a quiet moment over coffee, that he had just learned the apartment lease was likely to fall through as well, given the state of his finances, and that he genuinely didn't know where he would be staying within the month. He watched her face carefully as he said it, half expecting the same subtle recalculation he had seen flicker across Delphine's expression so many times in recent days. Harper simply set down her cup, thought for a moment, and told him plainly that her father's place had an extra room sitting empty since she had moved out years earlier, and that he was welcome to stay there as long as he needed, no explanation or justification required. The offer stunned him, not because of its generosity alone, though that alone would have been enough, but because of how naturally and immediately she made it, without a single flicker of hesitation or calculation crossing her face. She didn't ask what it might mean for their friendship, or whether it was appropriate given their professional history, or what people might think. She simply saw a friend in a difficult position and offered the one thing she genuinely had to give. Weston never actually needed to take her up on the offer, since the apartment lease had never truly been at risk in the first place. But the moment stayed with him for days afterward, replaying in his mind at odd hours, standing in sharp, unavoidable contrast to every careful, self-interested question Delphine had asked him over that same stretch of time. He mentioned the exchange to his mother almost in passing one evening, not realizing how closely it mirrored the exact test she had been quietly running all along. Zelda listened without revealing anything, simply nodding and telling him gently that it sounded like Harper was a good friend to have, careful not to steer his growing feelings in any particular direction before he had fully arrived at his own conclusions. But privately, hearing that story confirmed something she had already begun to suspect with growing certainty. Some people needed an elaborate staged collapse to reveal who they truly were underneath the polish. Others revealed it in a single, unremarkable sentence offered over a cup of coffee, without ever knowing they were being watched at all. Before we continue into the part of the story that changes everything, if you're finding yourself invested in what happens next, take a second right now to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what Zelda overhears in the next few minutes is the moment this entire test comes to a head. The final confirmation Zelda needed arrived on a humid evening 9 days into the staged collapse, when Delphine invited an old college friend over to what she still fully believed was Weston's small rented apartment. Entirely unaware that Zelda had asked Weston to step out briefly on a manufactured errand, so she could observe the visit quietly from a modest guest room just down the hall. Delphine's friend, a woman Zelda vaguely recognized from an earlier engagement party, asked half-laughing whether Delphine was really planning to go through with the wedding now that the money's basically gone, and whether it wasn't smarter, from a purely practical standpoint, to simply walk away before things got even messier for everyone involved. Delphine sighed dramatically, the kind of theatrical sigh Zelda had heard her use before at dinner parties whenever a conversation grew mildly inconvenient, and admitted that she had already been quietly speaking with a divorce attorney about how prenuptial protections typically worked in reverse, in case she needed to distance herself cleanly from Weston's family before his mother's remaining debts somehow became her problem as well. She spoke about it with a casualness that made Zelda's stomach turn, discussing the potential end of a relationship she had claimed, only weeks earlier at their engagement dinner, to want more than anything else in the world. The friend pressed further, asking what exactly she planned to tell Weston directly once she had made her final decision. Delphine's answer was the sentence Zelda would carry with her, unwillingly, for the rest of her life. She said she intended to stage a gentle, carefully rehearsed heartbroken breakup within the next week or two, blaming the emotional distance and accumulated stress of the situation rather than admitting the real underlying reason, because admitting outright that she was leaving over money would make her look exactly like what she actually was to anyone who eventually heard the full story. She laughed lightly and added, almost as an afterthought, that she had already started quietly seeing someone new in the meantime, a wealthy real estate developer she had met at a charity event roughly 2 months earlier, someone whose fortune, in her own carefully chosen words, remained still fully intact regardless of what happened with the Monroe family. Zelda did not confront Delphine that same evening, though every instinct in her body urged her to walk directly into that living room and say everything she was feeling in that exact moment. She simply returned quietly to the small guest room, closed the door behind her, and sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap for nearly an hour, allowing herself to fully feel the weight of what she had just confirmed with her own ears rather than through second-hand suspicion or careful inference. This was not simply a woman who had been understandably overwhelmed by sudden, unexpected hardship. This was a woman who had already constructed an entire exit strategy, complete with a rehearsed lie and a fully formed replacement relationship, within just 9 days of believing the man she claimed to love had lost absolutely everything. The following morning, moving with the same calm, deliberate precision she had used to build an entire company from a rented garage decades earlier, Zelda called both Weston and Delphine to the mansion's guest house, telling them only that there was an important and time-sensitive update regarding the family's finances that both of them urgently needed to hear together, in the same room at the same time. Weston arrived first, visibly anxious, assuming the news would be even worse than what they had already absorbed over the preceding 2 weeks. Delphine arrived shortly after, composed and perfectly put together as always, entirely unaware that the version of events she had so carefully rehearsed for her own eventual breakup speech was about to become completely unnecessary. When Weston and Delphine had both settled into the guest house's small sitting room, Zelda calmly and clearly explained that the collapse had been staged from the very beginning, a deliberate and carefully constructed test designed to reveal the truth about the people closest to her son before an irreversible, life-altering mistake could be made. She watched Delphine's expression shift in real time from confusion to disbelief to a slowly dawning, horrified realization as the full weight of what her future mother-in-law was actually saying finally settled in completely. Weston, meanwhile, simply stared at his mother, momentarily unable to process that the last 2 weeks of genuine grief and fear had been an elaborate performance designed to protect him from something far worse than temporary financial hardship. Zelda then repeated, word for word and without a single detail softened, the conversation she had overheard between Delphine and her friend the previous evening, including the planned gentle, heartbroken breakup, the quiet meetings already scheduled with a divorce attorney, and the new relationship already forming comfortably in the background with a man whose fortune remained conveniently untouched. Delphine's face drained completely of color as she realized there was no version of events she could spin or soften, because Zelda had heard every single detail directly, sitting quietly down the hall with nothing but a cup of tea and a steadily breaking heart on behalf of her son. Weston sat in stunned silence for what felt like a very long time, staring at the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, searching desperately for some explanation that might somehow make sense of what he had just heard laid out so plainly in front of him. Delphine offered a series of increasingly desperate excuses about panic, about a genuine fear of instability she claimed she had never experienced before, about never truly believing the relationship would actually end this way even as she made concrete plans for exactly that outcome. She never once, in all her explanations, denied planning to leave him quietly and dishonestly rather than simply telling him the truth about what she was feeling and why. Reginald Voss and Adiz Bello arrived at the guest house a short while later, having been asked in advance to be present once the truth was finally revealed, and they walked Weston through exactly how the staged collapse had worked from a technical standpoint, showing him the real account statements that had remained fully intact the entire time, the carefully worded creditor notices that had never actually been filed with any court, and the temporary press arrangement that had allowed the rumor to spread only far enough to be convincing without ever becoming permanently damaging to the company's genuine reputation. Weston listened numbly, nodding at the right moments, though very little of the financial explanation actually registered. What stayed with him instead was the simple, devastating fact that his mother had trusted her instincts about Delphine enough to risk this much effort, and that her instincts, once again, had proven entirely correct. After Delphine left the guest house for the final time, Weston sat alone on the back steps for nearly 2 hours as the sun went down over the water, turning the entire conversation over and over in his mind, searching for the exact moment he should have seen it coming. He thought about the ring appraisal question on the very first day, the careful inquiries about offshore accounts, the sudden cancellations disguised as illness, and realized with a kind of quiet horror that the signs had been there almost from the beginning, visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. He wondered, sitting there in the fading light, how many other important truths in his life he had missed simply because he preferred the comfortable version of a story to the accurate one. Zelda found him there as the last of the daylight disappeared, and sat down beside him without saying anything for a long while, letting the silence between them do the work that words couldn't. Eventually she told him, quietly, that she hadn't run the test to prove herself right, or to embarrass Delphine, or even to protect the company's money, since none of it had ever truly been at risk in the first place. She had run it because she loved him enough to risk him being furious with her for interfering, rather than risk him spending the next 40 years married to someone who had only ever loved the version of him that came with a fortune attached. Weston didn't respond right away, but he leaned his head against his mother's shoulder the way he had as a boy, and for the first time since the guest house conversation, he allowed himself to simply grieve what he had lost without also having to defend it. The engagement ended that same afternoon, quietly and without a public scandal, without lawyers arguing bitterly over settlements that had never actually applied to a fortune that was never truly at risk in the first place, and without a single genuine possession changing hands beyond the engagement ring itself, which Delphine returned in stiff, humiliated silence before leaving the guest house without another word. Weston struggled visibly in the days that followed, not simply with the loss of the relationship itself, but with the deeper, more painful question of how close he had come to marrying someone capable of planning such a calculated, dishonest exit from a life she had claimed, only weeks earlier, to want more than anything else. In the weeks that followed, as the company's full recovery was quietly and believably staged for public appearances and reassured investors, Weston found himself leaning more and more on the one person who had shown up again and again without ever once being deliberately tested for it. He began inviting Harper to dinner, first simply as a genuine thank you for her steady loyalty during the hardest weeks of his entire adult life, and later because he found himself looking forward to her company in a way he honestly hadn't felt with Delphine in months, even during the earliest, easiest days of that earlier relationship. Zelda watched the two of them grow slowly and naturally closer with quiet, careful satisfaction, deliberately never pushing or interfering in any way, remembering clearly and painfully what it had once felt like to have her own hard-earned judgment questioned before she had ever been given the chance to prove it right. Months later, once the full truth of the recovered fortune was finally revealed to Harper as well, gently and carefully by Weston himself over a quiet dinner, she reacted not with excitement or relief over the money involved, but with a long, careful, thoughtful silence, followed eventually by a simple, genuine question about whether Weston himself was truly all right after everything he had personally been through during those difficult weeks. It was, Zelda would later say to close friends, the exact reaction that confirmed everything she had already quietly suspected about the humble, unassuming young woman who had never once asked either of them for anything at all, even when she had every reasonable justification to. Weston proposed to Harper 8 months later, in a small, private ceremony overlooking the same stretch of coastline his mother had built her entire empire beside decades earlier, with absolutely no staged tests required this time, because the truth had already revealed itself fully in the only moments that ever truly matter between two people. Harper cried when he asked her, not because of the ring or the view or the life it represented, but because, as she told him quietly afterward, she had simply never imagined someone would choose her for exactly who she was, without ever needing her to be anyone or anything else. On the day of the wedding itself, Zelda stood near the back of the small gathering, watching her son wait at the end of a modest aisle strung with simple string lights rather than the elaborate floral arches Delphine had once insisted on for a much larger ceremony. Harper wore her mother's altered wedding dress rather than anything designer, and walked down the aisle on her father's arm with the same steady, unhurried confidence she carried into every room at the office, entirely unbothered by the absence of the grand spectacle her fiancé's fortune could easily have afforded. Zelda found herself thinking, watching the two of them exchange vows in front of barely 60 guests, about the exact moment nearly a year earlier when she had first decided to fake losing everything her family owned, and how strange it was that the truest wealth she had ever witnessed in her life had nothing to do with any of it. During the small reception that followed, Zelda pulled Harper aside for a quiet moment near the edge of the gathering, away from the music and the toasts, and told her honestly, for the first time, the full extent of what the staged collapse had actually involved, including the guest room down the hall and the conversation she had never been meant to overhear. Harper listened carefully, and when Zelda finished, she simply asked whether Weston knew how much his mother had risked, emotionally, to protect him that way, and whether he understood that being loved that carefully was its own kind of rare gift most people never received from anyone in their entire lives. It was, Zelda thought later, exactly the kind of question a genuinely good person asks without being prompted to, and exactly the reason she had never once doubted her decision to let the test run its course. What lingers longest about this story isn't the elaborate staged collapse itself, or even the quiet, unforced engagement that eventually formed in its aftermath. It's the uncomfortable, deeply personal question it leaves behind for every single one of us watching from home. How many people in our own lives would genuinely still choose us the moment there was nothing left to gain from staying close to us at all? Zelda Monroe had $200 million sitting quietly in accounts around the world. And still, in the end, the only thing that truly protected her son from a devastating mistake wasn't a single dollar of it. It was patience, careful and painful observation, and the willingness to watch quietly and wait long enough to see the truth for exactly what it really was. no matter how much it hurt to witness along the way. Was it truly fair for Zelda to test two people's hearts so carefully without their knowledge or consent? Or did she have every right as a mother to protect her son the only way she genuinely knew how, after everything her own difficult life had taught her about the people who show up and the people who simply take? Would you have recognized Harper's quiet, consistent loyalty as quickly as Zelda eventually did? Or would the surface-level polish and easy confidence of someone like Delphine have fooled you too, at least for a little while? Let us know exactly what you think down in the comments below. And if this particular story moved you the way we hope it did, wait until you hear what happens in our very next video, where a completely different family uncovers a truth that had been sitting quietly in plain sight for years without anyone noticing at all. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a single one of our upcoming videos here in the Behind Closed Doors playlist.